My name is Elizabeth. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm really glad you're here. Today I have a true crime story for you. And it's one of those stories where I can tell you about one absolute fact, and everything else is up for conjecture. So it's one of those, and I would love to hear your opinion on it. But I do want, before I get started, trigger warning, today's story will discuss the following, which I'm going to give you some codes that I'm going to use. So child will be referred to as CP from here on out. Will be referred to as SA from here on out. Since the only R word that happens in this is to children, when I do refer to the R word, I'm referring to child. And finally, when I refer to, I will call it the S word from here on out. And that, I think, gives you a pretty good idea of the kind of things we're going to be covering. If that's not something you think you can deal with right now, please turn this off and find something else. Watch, Bob's Burgers or read a good book. And we'll catch you next time. But for those of you who would like to hear about this wacky case, join me for the ride. Our story starts with Arnold Friedman. Now, Arnold was born on April 12th, 1937. When Arnold was 4, his sister passed from blood poisoning. The death was said to be both sudden and horrible. Now, a year later, Arnold's little brother Howard would be born, but the death of the sister was said to have just destroyed the couple's marriage. So after the marriage fell apart, the two boys went with their mom, and they lived in a basement apartment with one bedroom. All three of them slept in different beds, but in the same room. But it was said that their mother would bring home men and engage in sex activity with these men in front of the boys, whether the boys were there or not. He sounds like she just sort of lived her life. It's interesting. It's not a great choice. We should make better choices for our children. Arnold has said that he began to experiment with his sexual identity and sexual behavior around the age of 13, and that his first partner was his little brother, who was 8 at the time. Now, Howard, his brother, has no memory of this. He says he knows that his brother says he did this. He has zero memory. He cannot recall any trauma from his brother that he put him through ever during those years. Take with that what you will. Like I said, this is one of those cases you never know what's really happening. So Arnold revealed that he did this with his brother over the course of a few years. Then he says that he started to have partners that were boys his own age. And he says that when he was an older teen, he started to worry that he was still attracted to the boys that his brother was when he was 13, which was 8. Later on, he would worry again when he had his own children, but you know what? We'll get to that. Okay. So, sorry if I'm laughing. It's because the story is horrifying. So it's a nervous laughter. It's not, they think this is funny. It's not. So Arnold majored in chemical engineering at Columbia University in New York. But after he graduated, he went off and tried to have a music career. At the time, Latin music was the big thing. So he changed his name to Arnito Ray. And he played with a band in the Catskills. And Latin music was what they played. So he was Arnito Ray. So when he first headed out after school, he tried the artist life. Now, he would marry Elaine. And she reportedly says that she thinks she's the only girl that Arnold ever even dated. Okay, she tells us that she had to push Arnold into the marriage, that they dated for a while, and finally she was like, come on, like, we got to do this, and he didn't want to, and she says that she pushed, and he finally gave in. So Arnold's brother, Howard, tells us that the family was so excited for Arnold and Elaine. She was, he described her as effervescent and pretty, and they seemed comparable, they seemed in love, and he also says that his mother, who was ready to be a grandmother already, was very excited about this marriage. I believe it was the 1960s, early 1960s, I believe, when they got married. Arnold then became a high school chemistry teacher. From everyone, every perspective, even from Elaine was difficult. She says she was difficult. The family doesn't really go into details on the subject, but it seems to me like she got her way, right? That even if she and Arnold would disagree, ultimately she would always get her way, and Arnold would always just allow her to get her way. It's the feeling that I get. I'm not 100% sure, but I have a good reason for feeling that way, and I bet you will too. But we'll see. Okay, so the couple would have 3 boys. The youngest was born near the end of the decade, I think 68, but don't quote me on that. David, Seth, and Jesse. Okay, so the 3 boys were really tight. And the 4 males in the family were really tight. They all love music. They love to perform. They had the same sense of humor. They were dramatic, and David would explain, he's the oldest, he would explain that like one of them would make a joke, and then the next one would pile on, and the next one would pile on, and then the next thing you know, they're all laughing for the next 2 hours over this crazy thing that just the 4 of them got. And that Elaine explained them as like a gang, like the guys were a gang, like the 4 of them were just connected and got each other, and she was mom who didn't let dad have his way. It's how it feels the dynamics were in this family. The oldest would also report that he believes, this is a joke that a lot of kids make, that like if you've got one sibling, your parents had sex twice. They made one of the first of you, and then they made the second of you, and then they never did it again because ew, gross, how could our parents do that? So he says he really believes that's true about his mother, that was very sexually repressed. What's interesting is that Elaine would her account of their sex life was that she always had to pull Arnold into it, and he treated it like work, and she would try to convince him it was supposed to be fun. She's quoted to saying at one point, it's called foreplay. It's supposed to be fun, and he just didn't get it. So some more pieces of the puzzle for you. So the feeling I get is that she was one of those overbearing moms who got her way, right? Arnold gave her way, and the boys were on their father's side because of that amazing connection the 4 of them had, and he wasn't in charge of the house, and so the boys always defended him, and that never, ever changes. Even when he admits to the boys some of the terrible things that he has done. So according to David, the oldest, he says that he thinks that it was because he didn't really want to spend time with his wife, that Arnold didn't want to spend time with Elaine, that he started to fill up his off time with other things. So he started to teach piano lessons after school and on the weekends. He started teaching a computer class 6 days a week in their basement. I'm going to take a step back from the story for a second and talk about the zeitgeist of the time. There was this nationwide hysteria in the 1980s. The essay of children was something that before this, society had a very hard time accepting. Like people just didn't believe that it would happen. Then if a father did essay his daughter, it was due to a problem with the marriage. That's what it was considered. It was considered that the wife was responsible because she wasn't allowing herself to be as available to her husband as she should, and therefore he is starting to sexualize his daughter, which is the wife's fault. Sorry, it's so asinine. I mean, people went to therapy for this, and they made it like it was a mood disorder, it was a personality disorder, but it wasn't a crime because they didn't believe that these people would ever abuse someone who wasn't in their own family. It was like a familiar relationship problem. Look, the reason that this happens, that essay happens, is for one reason and one reason only. It's because the predator wants it to happen. That's it. That's the crux of it. The abuser wants to abuse. He wants to engage in whatever awful behavior will satiate his feelings and give him what he needs. And any excuse that we give that is ridiculous. This is an abuser wants to abuse, and it's not okay. Once society started to accept the fact that SA does occur, society couldn't deal with the fact that it mostly happens within a family. Our families, our houses, our parents, they're supposed to be the safe place. Children should be safe in their own homes, right? We would much rather it be stranger danger. So there was this huge movement on stranger danger, and stranger danger is real. It is. But SA, especially SA that happens over time, happens in the home for the most part. Strangers don't really have the capacity to re-abuse the same victims unless they've been kidnapped, which is a completely different situation. Okay, so society did not understand what child's SA was. The police and the authorities were working under this assumption that this theory, CSAAS theory, was correct. Now, this is the Child Sexual Abuse Accommodation Syndrome theory. Now, under this idea, proof that abuse happens includes immediate disclosure, delayed disclosure, withdrawal, and sustained denial. So, telling someone, waiting to tell someone, or not telling someone. So, what exactly can a child say to prove that they were not abused under this plan? There's nothing. The kid says, no, it didn't happen, and that's proof it happened. The kid finally changes their mind because you've been asking them so often and they're sick of it. That proves it happened. The kid is just like, you know what? I'm going to change my mind because this will make you happy. There you go. It's proof. They continue to deny it. They won't even talk to you about it. Proof. There's a problem here. It's a really big problem. Where does the child who hasn't been abused? Like, where do they live? Where do they answer? What do they say? This was part of the panic of this child abuse moral panic of the 80s and 90s. Because when children were asked things, first they were asked, not in the way that we now know you should ask children, what happened to them? You say, what happened? And then you shut up and you listen. And if they slow down, you say, well, but then what happened? You never, ever say, we know what happened to you. Tell us. Which is exactly what the police did. They went to these children, whatever child it was, whoever they thought, if they thought that there was a daycare that was hurting children, they would talk to every single child and they would literally say to them, we know what happened to you. Well, little ones, I know some adults, major people pleasers, really want to please the person that's with them, especially if they're a police officer or they're getting angry or they just keep asking. Why do they just keep asking? I told you no. Also, it's really important to note that when pushed and given positive reinforcement, a child's imagination can take over, especially when they're getting like, oh yeah, see, this is what we wanted to know. This is what we needed to hear about. So the way that alleged victims were questioned by the police and so-called professionals would ultimately be called into question and ultimately completely changed in future investigations. At this point now, it's supposed to work that a child who has to recount something that has happened to them, it is supposed to be, first of all, interviewed by somebody who knows how to do the interview, where they don't put ideas or thoughts or anything into their minds. And also it's supposed to be recorded so that the child doesn't have to go through it again and again and again and again and again, which is re-traumatizing. So we have learned a lot since then. But at the time, this was the zeitgeist. The zeitgeist was if a child said, no, I didn't, I wasn't, they were. And the police would continue to ask and continue to ask until they actually got the answer they wanted. I mean, it's awful. If you look back at some of the cases, with absolutely no evidence at all. Many child care workers ended up behind bars because of this panic, this hysteria, there's a case in Italy that's just awful. There's the McMartin case, which most people have heard of, but there's a lot. And with absolutely zero evidence except for children who were pushed into a narrative These people were put behind bars, which is terrible. Okay, so that's the zeitgeist. That's the world we're living in, right? I'd like to remind you that there is one absolutely true, can be proven piece of evidence, and that is in this entire story. Ultimately, I'm interested to hear what you think after you hear the whole story, so please stick around for the whole thing. Okay. Now we've covered, like, the zeitgeist at the time. We can talk about the crime. Okay, so now you know who the Friedmans are, and you understand the zeitgeist. So, in 1984, a package of CP was seized by the U.S. government and had been shipped from the Netherlands. The package was addressed to Arnold Friedman of Great Neck, Long Island. He at the time was an award-winning chemistry high school teacher. And there's a U.S. Postal Inspection Agency, so they're like the law enforcement agency that oversees mail. And they began an investigation because they wanted to be sure that this wasn't just like sent to a random person, that this wasn't, Arnold intended to receive this. Because, you can send something to anyone, and can you really blame someone for something that was sent to their house, especially without their knowledge? So they basically started like a sting, like a undercover operation where they started sending letters back and forth between Stan, who was the postal worker undercover guy, and Arnold. And they were discussing these. So in the 80s, CP was distributed through magazines. There were like literally magazines that were made. So this was what was shipped. And that's what Stan and Arnold are talking about. And he finally gets Arnold's trust enough to get Arnold to send him a magazine, which Arnold does. And he sends it to him, and he puts a note on the top of it, and it says, "Enjoy." I'm sorry. Ugh. When Arnold doesn't get anything in return, because the deal was, you send me something, I'll send you something, he starts to ask for his magazine back. He's like, well, if you're not going to send me anything, that's fine, but then give me my magazine back. Like, we were swapping, but now you haven't sent me anything, so just give me mine back. It's the 3rd of November, 1987. So this took 3 years, because it was 84 when the package was originally seized. So now it's November 3rd, 1987, and an inspector dressed as a postman hands the delivery to Arnold. He signs for it. He takes it. An hour later, the same man shows up. Now he's wearing a suit. He's not in the postal outfit anymore. He's in a suit. And he says, I have a warrant to search your home for this magazine. And at first, Arnold says, well, there's nothing like that here. I don't know why you're here for that. And the officer says, you don't recognize me? An hour ago, I was the one asking for your signature. I know full well what you have in there. I'm the one who delivered it. So Arnold's like, okay, fine. Okay, yeah, I have it here. And he goes up to his room. He shows me, he says, come up to, goes up to his room, and he has it hidden in a drawer in his bedroom. And Arnold says, here you go. This is all there is. And he's surprised to hear that the rest of the house is going to be searched. And he's like, why don't you just search the rest of the house? I'm telling you, this is it, And of course, the whole point is to search the whole house. After they search the house, they find in Arnold's home office, which is in the basement, a stack of 30 magazines with titles like Jailbait, Chicken Pickens, Up, Over, Down, Over, Young Boys and the S Word. Except they didn't say S word. Okay, so they find these 30 magazines. Now they're in Arnold's office. They're downstairs. These are completely illegal. This is the abuse that had to be done to these children to be in pictures. It's already been done. And that's just awful. So this is our absolute 100% moment. Arnold likes looking at pictures. We even hear Elaine say it at one point. Arnold looks at pictures. Arnold likes to look at pictures. Arnold has CP. That is the one fact that I can prove up and down and sideways, and right and left, and north and south, and really prove that happened. Everything else is up for speculation. Okay? As they are searching for these, they find these magazines. They search, the whole office, and they find a list of 81 boys between the age of 8 and 11 who have been taking an after-school computer class Arnold runs in his basement of his home for the past 5 years. He runs it 6 days a week. Now, that's 6 different classes. That's not, I think it was once a week. So there's a bunch of different classes. And so Arnold is charged with owning and distributing, child abuse content, which is definitely what he did. And then the postal agency sends his name and this list of boys to the Nassau County Police Station to be investigated. Okay, Nassau County is where Great Neck is, and this is on Long Island. Police of Nassau County starts talking to the boys on the list. And within the first 12 days, 35 boys were interviewed, and of those 35 boys, 12 said that Arnold had abused them, shown them pornography, and or encouraged them to play sexually explicit computer games. Jesse tells us, the youngest, that he was home the weekend before Thanksgiving from college. He went to a SUNY school, I'm not sure which one, a New York State school that was, not far. And so he had been home on the weekend, and that weekend before Thanksgiving, Arnold had gathered his boys at his mother's house, so not at the boys' mother's house, their grandmother's house, and had disclosed some, what Jesse would call troubling information. Okay, he admits that he had taken sexual advantage of his brother when he was young, when he was a child. That he had been a homosexual during his teenage years, and that he liked to look at pictures of young boys, and that he had a collection of magazines. He told his sons that he had been fired from his high school job and his high school teaching job that morning, and only one student had showed up for that afternoon's computer class. Now it's November 25th, so it is the day before Thanksgiving. Okay. Officers broke down the Friedmans' door and arrested Arnold. The second search would turn up sexually explicit computer games, which we already knew about, pictures of naked boys. None of the boys from his classes, either computer or high school, and a poster encouraging homosexuality with boys. And the youngest child in the family, Jesse, as I mentioned earlier, returns home from college for Thanksgiving break, so he gets home on that Wednesday. David reports that he sort of grabbed him and pulled him into the backyard because nobody could go in the house. They were doing a search, and he's like, what is going on? And the police ask what they're doing back there, and David says, I'm just hanging, it's my brother, and he just got home and whatever. And the family is shocked when Jesse is arrested with his father. Turns out 2 of the boys had implicated Jesse as well. He had helped his dad with the computer classes, and one of the boys alleged that Jesse took photographs of Arnold R-wording a boy from the class. On December 7th, Arnold and Jesse were formally charged with 91 counts of abuse against minors. It was really remarkable, as this is the very, very first time that, so this is 87, that cameras were allowed in the Nassau County courtroom. And so you can hear both men pleading not guilty. Jesse appealed his bail, that it was excessive, and was allowed to be home to prepare for his trial. Arnold would spend 6 weeks in jail and then be allowed to go home to prepare. He was under house arrest the whole time. He had the ankle monitor, the whole thing. Within 10 days of the arraignment, 11 more boys implicated Jesse in the abuse. So what had been 2 is now 13. And the total number of allegations increased dramatically. They alleged that Jesse beat them viciously and that Arnold took explicit photos. They told story of this leapfrog game that, yuck. Ugh. If you do your own research to find out what that was. On the 25th of March, 1988, Arnold would plead guilty to abusing 41 children. He denied 12 others and said none of them had been his high school students. He pled guilty to 8 counts of the S word, 28 counts of SA, 4 counts of attempted SA, and 2 counts of child endangerment. So Arnold had to, after he gave his guilty plea. He had to do a closeout statement. Now, a closeout statement is like, this is what I did. And Arnold agreed to do it on the agreement nothing he said could be used against Jesse or him in future trials. And what's really interesting is at first, Arnold denies everything he just pled guilty to. He has a conversation with his lawyer. He admits to abusing each child on the list so that he cannot be charged with abusing those boys again, because that's the agreement. Arnold even told them that younger children are easier to distract with computer games and allow you to do whatever you want with them. He was sentenced to 10 to 30 years in prison. But Jesse still has his trial coming up, right? So the police continue to talk to victims. Only, I think, 2 new victims were contacted, but the accusations were becoming more and more violent and outrageous, and 6 of the boys were now implicating a third person, his name by the name of Ross Goldstein. Ross had helped with the class as well. I think he was friends with Jesse. Maybe he was a little older, maybe a little younger. I'm not sure which. But by August of that year, Ross had a deal for 6 months in prison and 5 years probation if he testified against Jesse. Ross would do that. Ross said that Jesse actually forced him into a homosexual relationship and into abusing these boys as well. So, by the time Jesse is actually charged and sent to trial, the number of allegations against him are over 300. 17 witnesses, including his friend Ross, are willing to testify against him. So this is when Jesse does something I don't think anyone could have predicted. At this point, from the moment that this happened, he had been swearing by his innocence. He declared his innocence, and he stuck with it from day one. And he turns around and he pleads guilty. Jesse knew that he could spend up to 50 years or more in prison if found guilty on these 300 charges. So he pled guilty to 24 counts of abuse on minors and the agreement that he would be given a lesser sentence. He was ultimately sentenced to 6 to 18 years in prison. Ross Goldstein was sentenced between 2 and 6 years, even though he had gotten a deal for 6 months. That would ultimately be commuted. Now, this is the part of the story that I think is the most shocking. I even know his reasoning and I don't get it. So, about a month after being sentenced, or pleading guilty and being sentenced, Jesse Friedman did an on-air interview with Geraldo Rivera. Why? Geraldo Rivera fit very well into the hysteria of the time. He was actually one of the people who helped to fan that hysteria's flame. This particular episode was called Busting the Kiddie Porn Underground. Did a whole show on Satanists and Satanism as if it was a real thing. Satanism is a real thing, but it's not evil and actually worshiping Satan. People who are Satanists they're actually atheists. Like, it's a whole thing. But he is now, we all understand how unreliable he is as a journalist. I don't even feel good calling him a journalist. But why Jesse went on there is beyond me. So in this interview, Jesse confessed to have fondling boys, of taking pictures of boys, of having R-worded them. He confesses to threatening to kill their parents because, if they tell. He then accuses his father of abusing him from when he was a child. He's swearing he's innocent, he's swearing he's innocent, he's swearing he's innocent. And then he decides, oh, okay, well, I'll tell you I'm guilty so I can get 18 years instead of 50. And a month later, I'm going to go on not live TV, but on network TV and tell Geraldo Rivera that I did these terrible things. I will never understand the logic of it. Why did he do this? We'll get to it, I promise. While Arnold Friedman was in prison, Elaine Friedman divorced him. I really can't blame her. The boys were very mad at her. In 1995, Arnold Friedman would end his own life, by overdosing on antidepressants. He must have been collecting them over time and not taking them so that he could do this. He set up a $250,000 life insurance policy in Jesse's name, and this was before the laws had changed and you couldn't leave life insurance after unaliving yourself. So that when Jesse got out, he would get this $250,000 insurance policy. He felt like it was the only thing he could do for his son at this point. It was the only power he had left. That was in 1995. So in 2001, Jesse was released after 13 years in prison. He was put on extreme parole measures, like extreme. A 12-hour curfew per day, ankle monitor at all times, mandatory attendance to SA treatment 3 times a day, and he is now a level 3 sex offender, which means he cannot be within, I think, 25 feet of a minor at any time. And here's the interesting thing. Like, I'm telling the story in as chronological order as I can, but I am going to go back by a year right now. So 2000, so about a year before Jesse gets out of prison, his older brother, David Friedman, who was professionally known as David K., he had an alter ego by the name of Silly Billy. Okay, he was a children's party clown. And at the time, he was the most popular children's party clown in all of New York City. I mean, like Eddie Murphy hired him once. There were articles on him in like the big newspapers in New York, and like he was it. Like if you wanted the best clown, you got David K., aka David Friedman, who is the oldest in the family. And a young filmmaker by the name of Andrew Jereki, and if you may have heard of him, he's done quite a lot since then. At the time, he was a self-made millionaire. He was one of the creators behind Movie Phone, which is a very big deal. He had decided he wanted to make a documentary, and he approached David because he wanted to tell the story of children's party clowns behind the scenes. Like, what's it like behind the scenes of being a children's party clown? It was supposed to be called Funny and Silly. Okay. And, but it would morph into something completely different. He never made Funny and Silly. He never did a documentary about party clowns, but he did do one with David. So Jereki would spend 8 months interviewing David. Okay. I mean, he really wanted to find out what was going on. So, and in doing this, he would discover that there was a lot of darkness in David's past. And David wouldn't talk about it. But finally, he would get David to talk about it. And it turns out that the day that Arnold and Jesse Friedman were arrested, David brought home a new Super 8 movie camera and began filming. He would capture, pun intended, over 12 hours of the most intense family interactions, ones that feel like I shouldn't be watching this. Like, I'm totally, like, I'm a voyeur. This is not my family. Like, those kinds of arguments where you're like, like if you're at the house when this happens, you want to like crawl under the sofa because you're not part of the family. And so with this footage, along with audio tapes that Jesse started making and home footage from the family while the boys were growing up, Jereki would end up creating an Oscar-nominated documentary called Capturing the Friedmans, which is all about this case. And a crime that had been allegedly committed in the 80s, and who the perpetrators were either dead or out of prison, would resurface as a pretty big controversy. Let's talk about Elaine. Okay, the wife mother of the story. Elaine refuses to say that Arnold is innocent of these charges. And she knows, I think she knows he's not, but she refuses. She says she doesn't want to lie. She often says she has no idea whether whether this is true or this isn't true, but her interviews are really telling. She reports that he didn't enjoy having sex with her, that he didn't enjoy foreplay, as I mentioned before. And through the family videos, we can see the three boys turn their back on their mother, like they just fully 100% support their father. They are cruel to Elaine. And when you watch it, it's really uncomfortable. They have this fight. He's my husband. He doesn't belong to you. He's my father. He doesn't belong to you. And Arnold's voice isn't heard at all. So it's really, the fact that you get to see this footage feels almost too intimate. What does this documentary reveal that the facts of the case, as I told them before, didn't? So even though the allegations of many, and when I say many, I mean like hundreds of photos and videos were taken of these boys and their abuse done to them, none, not one, has ever come to light. Now, was all of it collected and burned? Maybe. Did it never exist? Maybe. Also, during the 5 years that this computer class ran, and the boys who took it would return semester after semester, and never once did any of them complain about mistreatment. No one left the class bruised because of being violently beaten by Jesse, as was alleged. No one left the class was bleeding from repeated S-wording. Okay? No one said anything until the police started asking. That's suspect, right? So Nassau County, the Nassau County Police, who did a shit job. I'm sorry. I have no problem saying that. They did a shit job. I know the zeitgeist of the time was such that they questioned in the completely wrong way, but like, check this out. Nassau County never provided transcripts or videos of the interrogations with the boys from the class, ever. There were never any videos or transcripts. Turns out the police didn't even start taking notes on interviewing them until they admitted that the abuse happened. So if they asked the kid 12 times and 12 times he said no, and the 13th time he said yes, that 13th time was written down as the very first. That's shady. Also, if they didn't get the answer they wanted from the boys, of course, they would leave, and then they'd come back again. And one mother recalled that the police interviewed her child 15 times and said that they would continue until as long as it takes. How many no's do you have to get before you believe it? So one student admits that he thought he would just tell them what they want to hear so that this can end. And this child's testimony would end up leading to 16 counts of S-word against the father and son. And this is a kid who has said, I just told them what they wanted to hear because I was done. So, as mentioned before, transcripts and recordings of the interviews of the children were not kept, or maybe even made, okay? They didn't keep written track of how many times they talked to each child. The notes only began once they admitted the abuse was taking place. The documentary alleges that some of the students who denied the abuse were made to go under hypnosis to recall memories, which we now know can cause the implementation of false memories. But we'll get to that, I promise. So the next big thing that happens is in 2010, Jesse files for habeas corpus relief. Okay, now, lawyer speak, law speak. I didn't go to law school, but here's what I can gather. The great writ of habeas corpus is a, quote, fundamental right in the Constitution that protects against unlawful and indefinite imprisonment. So, translated from Latin, it means show me the body. So it's like, you know, if there isn't sufficient evidence, you shouldn't be locked up. Habeas corpus has historically been an important instrument to safeguard individuals' freedoms against arbitrary executive power. It's important to remember that. Arbitrary executive power. So the people who have the power over Jesse just, you know, choosing what they wanted to do. Jesse filed an appeal with the Second Circuit judge in 2010 saying that he was denied habeas corpus. The appeal was denied only because he waited too long to file his appeal. Okay, the statute of limitations was over. While the second court judges were not able to grant habeas corpus due to the late filing, that did not mean that they couldn't voice their concerns over how Jesse had been convicted. They refer to the moral panic of the 80s and 90s and how child abuse stories from that time seemed to run like wildfire. The vast majority of child abuse convictions had been overruled due to this very reason. They also concluded that Jesse had really no other option than to plead guilty. The judge in the case had publicly said, she was convinced of his guilt before hearing any evidence or testimony. So, that doesn't seem right to me. Judges are not supposed to make the decision before they hear any evidence or testimony. What? This is so very wrong. So very terrible. She also made it clear that if Jesse was found guilty, that she would impose the highest possible punishment, which would have resulted in at least a 50-year prison sentence. So the chances of Jesse actually receiving a fair trial, led by this judge, was a near impossibility. Okay, so the second court judges conclude that there is reasonable likelihood that Jesse Friedman was wrongfully convicted. There was a substantial lack of evidence against him, and also a substantial amount of evidence that the police had forced children into making false accusations. The recommendation from this court is that the DA should reinvestigate the case against Jesse because basically the DA and Nassau County Police Department did a terrible job investigating this case. So the DA at the time of this ruling, Catherine Rice, was then required to carry out a conviction integrity review on the case against Jesse Friedman. Prior to the review's completion, many of the students, including Ross Goldstein, recanted their allegations. Ross wrote a 10-page letter explaining the treatment he had received from the police and the DA's office, harassed, tortured, and coerced to make testimony against Jesse as well as himself. He was threatened with a prison sentence that would encompass the rest of his life, and he truly felt he had no other choice. This was his only option. Quote, "My testimony before the grand jury was a result of tremendous and unrelenting pressure and intimidation by the police and district attorney, in which I was eventually coerced to lie about the crimes taking place in order to save myself. It was the only way I had to avoid the possibility of spending my entire adult life if convicted by a jury, in jail if convicted by a jury." Another vital recantation came from someone we only ever knew as Witness 10. Witness 10 was the first one who ever said that Arnold S-worded him. And he was the first ever to allege that Jesse was a part of the abuse. Many other students from the class named Witness 10 as one of the boys who they had seen be abused. And this is his quote. "Never Arnold nor Jesse ever engaged in any sexually inappropriate acts with him or anyone else that he witnessed." Oh, I'm sorry, that's a quote from his lawyer, not directly from him. He admits that only after the police continued to question him relentlessly that he lied so that they would just leave him alone. So Rice reported that these recantations could not be trusted. Especially the one from Witness 10, due to the fact that he would not testify again for this review of the case. I'm assuming he wanted to put it behind him. He had said his piece, but okay. Another recounted statement was thrown out by Rice because it wasn't one of the testimony statements that was actually used in evidence. I'm not really sure I get that. The Rice Report, as it becomes known as her conclusions. So I read this thing. It's over 170 pages. Most of the report feels like an angry DA trying to defend her office, which I find really disturbing. I feel like when it comes to the law, your feelings shouldn't play in, especially if you're the one who's doing the judging. Do you know what I mean? Like, she's like personally offended that she has to do this. And it reads that way, which I find really upsetting. Okay. What do we know from the Rice? So Rice dismisses the idea that the police re-interviewing the boys until they changed their story. She says that couldn't have happened. She says, no, that couldn't have happened. There wasn't the time for it. I mean, all this interviewing, this amount of time, that never could have happened. Even though there's testimony from parents that that exact thing happened. So what she said is, given the compressed timeline, it is unlikely the detectives would have been able to repeatedly visit any one household for hours at a time to induce a child to make false accusations. So that's one of her points. The review team did not find any evidence of re-questioning. An exception to this was a complainant who was interviewed early on in the original investigation. He wrote a letter in May 2013 claiming that his statements were a product of repeat questioning. The complainant refused to speak to the review team. Witness 10's recantation is considered suspect because he wouldn't agree to be interviewed for this second investigation. Witness 25 who recanted, it wasn't used in the grand jury, so it wasn't part of the outcome. Peter Pinero was Jesse's lawyer, and he had arranged for Jesse to take a lie detector test, which demonstrated that he was not truthful. Now, my question about this point is, if we can't rely on lie detector tests enough to be used in court, then why is she allowed to use it here, right? I mean, this was a 19-year-old kid who was terrified. And we have learned that these lie detector tests don't necessarily give us truth and lies and show us what is true and what is lies. It's just, the human condition is just too complex for that. So I just don't understand how she can use this as a point when you can't use it in court of law. In the case of the students saying that they never saw such abuse occur, she says, well, that doesn't matter. They could have been in a different class where there wasn't any abuse. I mean, Arnold didn't keep any records of attendance or whatever, so there was no way to figure out who was where and who was when. So just because there were some kids that didn't see any, that doesn't prove that it didn't happen. Hey, there's logic to that. She also says that many parents affirmed that in hindsight, their children did, in fact, exhibit signs of abuse. One student had started defecating in his clothing, another wet the bed, a third child lost his hair, there were reports of sleeplessness, nightmares, stuttering, a decline in school performance, separation anxiety, and an overwhelming sense of fear. One parent found blood in his son's underwear. My question is, how do we know that that was caused by the abuse done allegedly by Jesse and Arnold and not the abuse done by the police? I would like to know when they saw these things. Did they see these things before they knew anything was going on, or did they see these things once the questioning started? We don't have an answer to that. The Rice report says that this is not the same situation as the moral panic that has happened in other cases. In the McMartin case, which is the most famous case, the kids were like 4. These children were twice the age, so you cannot compare. And also, there was proof that Arnold did have and traded in CP. Also, she says both defendants were willing to plead guilty when those defendants refused, even though they were facing harsh sentences. And there were some witnesses who doubled down, who didn't recount, who said, no, what I said before is absolutely true, and it is still true. In the report, she says that there's no more unreliable testimony than recanted testimony, meaning the recantation can't be trusted. Not that the original testimony can't be trusted. That if anyone says that they're recanting their testimony, you really can't believe that. Finally, so her final sort of take on it is, one, Jesse knew who the complainants were, so he could have interviewed them or talked to them or had his lawyer talk to them or see, He was also said he was well aware of the fact that nobody told anyone about any abuse until the police began to ask questions. He knew that one student, witness 28, who had been named a victim by the other children, had denied all abuse and was willing to testify on his behalf. And also that in the fall of 87, Jesse was away at college, and there were other kids who said things happened then, and Jesse obviously had not been there. And yet, despite all this information, Jesse still chooses to plead guilty. So her take on it is he's got all this in his going for him, and he still pleads guilty. She doesn't take into account the fact that the judge had said, I already know he's guilty. I haven't heard any testimony, seen any evidence. I know he's guilty. So I don't see how he would have gotten a proper trial. I think he probably would have been convicted, and then ultimately it could have been overturned, but that's not the direction that this story went in. Instead, both Arnold and Jesse pled guilty, and so all the testimony, the witness statements, nothing is scrutinized. Because it's scrutinized during a trial. That's when it's scrutinized. So because they said, yes, we did it, doesn't need to be scrutinized. And it's possible that it wouldn't have survived much scrutiny. Like I said, the attitude of this report is very of an offended DA who's like doing everything to prove that their office didn't do anything wrong, which, like, a DA checking a DA's work, isn't that kind of like, you know, letting the kids grade their own tests? I mean, it's like, it doesn't seem impartial. I don't know. But I will tell you that the Rice report does give us some new information that we did not have prior to the Rice report. And a couple of things that I felt are really part of the insane amount of information in this case that is, you know, what really happened. I want to tell you just really quickly something that really always sort of bothered me in the documentary. And that is when Elaine is talking about when Jesse was born, when Jesse was first born, and how Arnold was so enamored of him. And
Arnie looked at that baby and he said, that child is marvelous.
Maybe he behaved that way for the other kids and Elaine just doesn't remember. Or maybe there was something different. I don't know. Like, again, there's nothing I can know for sure, but she did say this thing about him. It is not proof of anything. It's just interesting information. Okay, so we got information from Howard. It turns out that Howard had been sworn to secrecy. The younger brother of Arnold had been sworn to secrecy by his brother. He said, as soon as I am gone and Jesse is out of jail, you can share these things. And the revelation is this. Arnold told him that he once molested Jesse. Just going to take a beat. Again, this is not from either the victim or perpetrator. This is from someone the perpetrator told. So this is hearsay. So again, what's real? But he did admit that he had once molested Jesse. He also told him that he and Jesse misbehaved with the children in computer class. Misbehaved. Well, there's an interesting choice of words. Misbehaved, like he showed them the sex computer games. They were 8 to 11, that's probably not cool. But that's not the same as S word, R word, essay. You know, like, what was it? You know, what does mistreatment mean? There's also another little bit of information I want to let you know from the documentary. When Arnold and Elaine were married, Arnold began to worry that he was going to have small boys in his house. Like, he wanted to make sure that he wouldn't do something wrong. And the therapist that he was seeing, I don't laugh because it's funny, I laugh because it's horrifying. The therapist he was seeing said to him, oh, well, you're not doing anything, so you're fine. So you're just going to go to New York City, and you're going to pick up some pornography. You know, illegal CP, the thing that we are absolutely sure that Arnold did do. So he's saying, get the urges out just by looking at pictures, and purchase this illegal stuff and have in your house. Like, what kind of crazy therapy is this? He also, Arnold had confessed to his wife that played around, he abused 2 14-year-old boys one year at their summer house years before there were ever any police involved. So when it comes to Elaine, I can't blame her for not being able to say he's innocent. She knows about this 14-year-old. She knows about the pictures. She knows that he's not interested in sex with her. She has too much information to say he's innocent. But I think it's kind of loyal and nice of her to have said, I don't know. That was the best she could do. And I don't blame her for that at all. I also understand how boys see their father as, their hero, their number one, and that these boys were really enamored of their father. It's a complicated story. But while Jesse was incarcerated, two notable things were found. This is also from the Rice Report. One was the picture of prepubescent boys from a Harper's Bazaar magazine in which one of the boys is not clothed. Now, this is not CP, but it's definitely something that we could call noteworthy. Also, it's a picture in his possession, not on his person, but with his stuff. Someone could have put it there just as easily as he could have, right? Right. But there's also this. Jesse wrote a very disturbing story, and he distributed it about a woman who engages in sex with a dog and then engages in child incest. And the story had a tag on it. I'm sorry, make this face, but the story had a tag on it that said that it was not written to encourage anyone to engage in incestual relationships. What? Why would you do that? When we go back to the footage of the family, the three boys are basically ganging up on Mom, who wants Arnold to plead guilty. She wants him to plead guilty because she thinks it'll help her son's case. It'll help Jesse's case, which ultimately Arnold does. So I think my theory is, she says do this and he says okay. And so he pled guilty. The problem was it didn't help Jesse. She was wrong about that. Him fighting the charges would have been much, much better in the long run. Both of them, if they'd fought the charges, it would have been far better. But there's no way to know that from where they were standing. Because like I said, this is when the police work would have been scrutinized and they would have seen, what they actually did. Okay, so I said we would get to this. Why did Jesse go on Geraldo? Now, in the footage, you can hear the boys talking about how much sympathy they might be able to garner from the public if they would get the media to debate this case, if they could get this out of Nassau County, out of Great Neck, bring the whole world in so that they can see that these people are being, nuts. And so, they were thinking that maybe he could turn into a victim for some kind of sympathy. But this didn't work. Jesse said that this was a tactic he had hoped would earn him sympathy from his inmates in prison. He wasn't even worried about the world at this point. He was just worried because of the treatment that he had gotten in jail at this point. He was always covered in urine. They were always throwing it at him. He, even in isolation, they would still find ways to beat him up. And, it's hard in prison when you have this kind of crime, and you've committed this kind of crime or been convicted. That's the word I'm looking for. You've been convicted of this kind of crime. His only focus of the Geraldo interview was to try to make himself victim turned predator, only to save himself, and then maybe he would be treated nicer by the... It didn't work. In the interview, he admits to taking hundreds of photos of the victims. No photos ever surfaced. And like I said, it's not exactly like we trust in Geraldo as a crack TV journalist in the U.S. Jesse has since said that interview was by far the biggest mistake of his life. Okay, false memories. The McMartin trial proved that false memories had been implanted into the minds of children. So what I want to ask you, is one worse than the other? If a child who suffers from abuse versus a child who thinks they suffered from abuse, is there a difference? Isn't the impact the same? The trauma is the same. In some cases, it's worse because the people who are supposed to believe them, their parents, the police, their teachers, don't believe them until they start lying. What that must do to the psyche of a child. I can't even. So what do we know for sure? Arnold Friedman, as his wife Elaine says in the documentary, liked to look at pictures. Arnold was a pedophile. I have no question on that. I believe that is truth. But the extent to which he acted on those feelings, totally up for debate. I can only be absolutely sure that he had CP in his possession. That's it. I did want you to know that Elaine got remarried. She married a man, and she said they live in a cottage, and they call it something peaceful something, and she said it's just peaceful, and that's all she's ever wanted. She loves it. In 2007, Jesse got married to Elizabeth, and it was reported that they were having a really hard time because Elizabeth wanted children, but Jesse, being a level 3 sex offender, can't be within 25 feet of any minors, so that makes it impossible for them to make a family. So in 2022, the couple divorced, and Jesse continues to fight to clear his name to this day. That is the story of Arnold and Jesse Friedman. Every time I find a new layer of this, it just makes me more confused. You know, hearing from people who are saying, no, I know that abuse happened to me. I can't doubt them. That's a victim. I'm not going to doubt a victim. But at the same time, I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. You know, watch the documentary. Give it a shot. I think it's, well, today, as I'm shooting this, it is definitely streaming on Max. I think the HBO part of Max. And I know you can watch it. I think you can watch it on YouTube, but I think it costs money now. So if you don't have like YouTube TV or whatever. I really want to know what you guys think. Like, do you think they did it? Do you think they didn't do it? Do you think they may have done a little bit, but it got blown out of proportion? I mean, he does admit to his brother that they messed around with kids in the class. I don't know what that means. I kind of sound like David. There's a point in the documentary where David is reading a letter about the letter that he wrote about messing with a couple of boys at their summer home. And he
One
says,
sentence, what does that mean? What, do you know what that sentence means? I don't even know what that sentence means. I don't know what that means. I don't know what that sentence means.
I agree. What does it mean? What does it mean? Who knows? I don't know that we'll ever really know. It is absolutely fascinating, and could only have happened at this one time in our society's moral panic world. So, thanks for hanging out for this whole, if you've managed to make it to the end, I really appreciate it. There's full show notes and below. Otherwise, do me a favor and be nice to each other out there and be nice to yourself. It's really important. And I'll see you next time. Bye.